Welcome, and thank you for joining this journey through the early history of an ancient people, a story shaped by struggle, belief, and constant interaction with the world around them. In this part of the narrative, attention turns to the neighboring nations who lived alongside the Israelites, including the Phoenicians, as well as the Arameans, Philistines, and Idumeans, each possessing distinct customs, traditions, and systems of belief. Alongside them were the Moabites and Ammonites, closely connected peoples who frequently came into contact with Israel. Through trade, conflict, and shared borders, the Israelites did not remain isolated. Instead, they gradually absorbed elements of these surrounding cultures, adopting certain customs and practices. Over time, this influence began to erode their internal cohesion. The unity of the tribes weakened, and the strong collective identity that once guided them started to fragment. This growing division led to a period of instability and vulnerability. Without firm unity, the tribes struggled to defend themselves and maintain order. In moments of crisis, individual leaders would emerge figures who rose temporarily to deliver the people from danger and restore a measure of stability. Yet their leadership was short lived, and lasting unity remained out of reach. The people known as the sons of Israel, who had already endured severe hardship during their long residence in the land of Egypt, now found themselves entering a new phase of trial, no less demanding than the former. Their new sphere of activity, the land of Canaan, was not isolated. It was surrounded on all sides by established nations, each possessing its own customs, traditions, and systems of belief. The Israelites stood in a position where they could preserve their distinct character only by two difficult paths, either by removing the surrounding populations entirely, or by resisting the strong and constant influence exerted by these neighboring peoples. Around them lived the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, the Arameans, the Philistines, the Idumeans, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Amalekites, as well as Arabian groups and peoples of mixed descent. Each of these communities maintained its own practices and religious observances. Through daily contact, whether by trade, proximity, or shared borders, the Israelites gradually came under the influence of these surrounding cultures. A powerful tendency toward imitation and adaptation began to act upon them, a force that operates even in more advanced societies. From this interaction arose a recurring pattern within the history of Israel. The people would lose their independence of thought and action, then recover it, only to fall again into the same condition, moving through repeated cycles of change. Over time, these fluctuations contributed to the formation of a more defined and resilient character, but during the period itself, the effect was one of instability. Among their neighbors, the closest and most influential contact was with the Phoenicians, particularly for the northern tribes of Asher, Zebulun, and Issachar. These tribes maintained strong connections with the coastal cities, especially Sidon, where the Phoenicians had already reached a notable level of advancement in trade and practical knowledge by the time the Israelites entered the land. Yet, despite this level of development, their moral and religious systems did not reflect the same degree of progress. In matters of ethical conduct, they remained comparable to less developed societies, though they were still considered to be somewhat above the level of the Egyptians in this regard. The religious practices of the Canaanites centered upon two principal deities, the male and the female powers known as Baal and Astarte. In certain cities, these deities were also referred to by other names, such as Adonis and Baltes. Baal was associated with the force of the sun, while Astarte was linked to the influence of the moon. However, these were not understood simply as celestial bodies, but as representations of the generative forces within nature itself. In addition to these, the Canaanites worshipped a group of seven celestial bodies, known collectively as the Kabiri, meaning the mighty ones. An eighth deity, Eshmun, was honored as a bringer of health and restoration, and was symbolized by the form of a serpent. The rituals associated with these beliefs involved practices that reflected their understanding of nature and fertility. Certain individuals, known as consecrated women, served within the temples as part of these rites. In the worship of Astarte, some adherents engaged in acts that involved altering their appearance and manner, taking on roles that symbolized devotion to the deity. These individuals moved among the people, gathering offerings intended for the support of the sanctuaries and their attendants. Such practices formed a central aspect of Phoenician religious life, and they were visible to the Israelites living among or near them. In the southern regions, the Israelites maintained closer relations with the Philistines. This people had migrated from a place called Caftor, identified with the city of Cydonia on the island of Crete. They established themselves along the coast, controlling three principal ports: Gaza in the south, Ashdod in the north, and Ashkelon between the two. Inland, they occupied the cities of Gath and Ekron. These five cities formed a compact political unit known as the Pentapolis, a federation that extended toward the frontier of Egypt and gained considerable influence. Because of their prominence, both Greek and Egyptian writers later used the name of this people to refer to the entire region, calling it Palestine, meaning the land of the Philistines. The Philistines, like the Phoenicians, were engaged in seafaring and trade, but unlike them, they also pursued expansion through conflict. Limited by their narrow coastal territory, they sought to extend their control inland. Their religious beliefs closely resembled those of other Canaanite groups. They worshipped a deity known as Dagon, representing the productive forces of nature, depicted as a being combining human and aquatic features. Their society included individuals who claimed the ability to predict future events through various forms of divination. These figures, described as soothsayers and interpreters of signs, held a recognized place within their culture. Contact between the Israelites and the Idumeans was less frequent. The territory of the Edom extended from Mount Seir down to the Red Sea. It is believed that the people of this region engaged in navigation along the Red Sea and maintained trade connections with Arabia. Their mountainous land contained valuable resources, including metals such as gold. The Idumeans were regarded as practical and discerning, and in early times they were governed by kings who were likely chosen rather than inheriting their position. To the north of this region, east of the Dead Sea, lived the Moabites and the Ammonites, neighbors to the Israelite tribes of Reuben and Gad. Their religious practices were similar in character to those of the surrounding nations. They honored a form of Baal associated with Mount Peor. Among the Ammonites, this deity was known as Milcom or Malcolm. Both the Moabites and the Ammonites also worshipped another god called Chemosh. Placed within such an environment, the Israelites faced constant pressure. The proximity of peoples sharing similar languages and ancestral connections made it difficult to maintain clear boundaries. They could neither isolate themselves entirely nor engage freely without absorbing external influences. Under these conditions, preserving both political independence and spiritual distinctiveness became an increasingly difficult task. From the very beginning of their settlement in the land, the Israelites found themselves surrounded not only by neighboring peoples, but by opponents. These surrounding nations did not understand the deeper purpose carried by the Israelites. They could not perceive that the teachings brought by this new people aimed at something far-reaching, the removal of idol worship, meaning the practice of revering physical objects such as statues, altars, and sacred groves as divine. The older inhabitants were unable to distinguish between their own material forms of religion and the more elevated, unseen conception of one God held by the Israelites. To them, the situation appeared simple and immediate. A new people had entered their land with weapons, seeking to take possession of territory that had long been theirs. This alone was enough to provoke hostility. The deeper ideas behind the Israelite beliefs were hidden from them, and therefore they reacted as any people might when faced with invasion. In dealing with these neighbors, whether openly hostile or quietly opposed, the Israelites were confronted with a difficult choice. They could engage in destructive warfare, seeking to eliminate their enemies entirely, or they could attempt to live alongside them through compromise and peaceful arrangements. Large-scale warfare, however, was not easily carried out. After the death of Joshua, the leader who had guided them through earlier victories, the Israelites no longer possessed a recognized central authority. Without such leadership, there was no coordinated plan for united action. In truth, the Israelites did not appear eager for continued conflict. Their long years of hardship, especially the trials they had endured in the desert, made them long for stability and peace. They sought to live quietly, maintaining tolerable relations with the peoples around them. This arrangement, though fragile, was acceptable to certain neighboring groups, particularly the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. These peoples were deeply engaged in trade and commerce, and their primary concern was the maintenance of open and secure routes for the movement of goods. However, not all neighboring nations were content with a state of peace. Certain groups, including the Idumeans, also known as the Edomites, the Philistines, a seafaring people settled along the coastal regions, and the Moabites, inhabitants of lands east of the Dead Sea, actively sought to harm the Israelites. These groups viewed the newcomers as a threat and acted accordingly. Among the Israelites themselves, the desire for a peaceful life led to a weakening of internal unity. The tribes became less concerned with the affairs of one another. This separation was further reinforced by the practice of intermarriage. Men and women from Israelite families began to form unions with individuals from surrounding nations. These marriages were especially common among the tribes living near the borders, where close contact with neighboring peoples was unavoidable. For these border tribes, such alliances offered a sense of security, creating bonds that might prevent hostility. At this early stage, there were no strict prohibitions against such marriages. As a result, they became increasingly common. The tribes located in the central regions of the land, such as those of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, were less inclined toward such unions. The tribe of Levi, set apart for religious duties, opposed them most strongly. They recognized the danger that lay in these relationships. From the act of marrying into foreign communities, it was only a short step toward adopting their religious practices. In the rural areas, this transition occurred with relative ease. The Israelites living in these regions still retained memories of earlier beliefs formed during their time in Egypt, where various forms of superstition had been practiced. Without a clear understanding of the difference between these older practices and the teachings received at Mount Sinai, they were vulnerable to influence. Gradually, many were drawn into the religious customs of their neighbors. The appeal of the Phoenicians played a significant role in this shift. Known for their skills in craftsmanship, trade, and cultural expression, they attracted admiration. Their practices, including their forms of worship, began to influence the Israelites. Over time, idolatry, once rejected, began to spread among a large portion of the people. The central place of worship for the Israelites during this period was the sanctuary at Shiloh. This was the location where the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses and the first high priest, together with the Levites, conducted religious ceremonies. However, Shiloh was not ideally situated. For tribes living far away, it was difficult to reach. Even those living nearby did not always regard it with favor. Tensions existed between the tribes, particularly involving the tribe of Ephraim, in whose territory Shiloh was located. The conduct of the Ephraimites, marked by pride and self-interest, caused dissatisfaction among neighboring groups. As a result, the sanctuary did not serve as a unifying center for the entire nation. At that time, sacrifices were still widely regarded as an essential part of religious life. People believed that offering sacrifices was necessary for maintaining a relationship with the deity. Those who adhered to this belief often built their own altars within their homes or chose to associate with local places of worship rather than traveling to a central sanctuary. This situation persisted because there was no strong leader to guide the people toward a more unified and purified form of worship. The Levites, who had been intended to serve as teachers and guides, were scattered among the various tribes. They lived mostly in small towns and villages, and because they did not possess land or wealth, they often struggled to sustain themselves. Their limited resources reduced their influence over the broader population. The weakness of their position is illustrated by a striking example. A Levite, who was said to be a grandson of Moses, the great lawgiver, accepted a position as a priest in a place where a newly created idol was being worshipped. He did so not out of conviction, but out of necessity, seeking food and clothing. This incident reflected the extent to which religious standards had declined. The spread of such practices was encouraged by several factors. Human desires, established habits, and the tendency to imitate others all contributed to the acceptance of idolatry. These influences combined to draw the people away from the teachings they had once received. Despite this decline, the memory of earlier events had not completely faded. The experiences in Egypt and the journey through the desert remained vivid in the collective memory of the tribes. These shared memories served as a bond, reminding them of their common origin and identity. Stories of the past were passed down through generations, strengthening the sense of belonging to one people. In times of hardship, individuals and families would recall these stories, asking where the acts of deliverance once witnessed had gone. They remembered how their ancestors had been brought out of Egypt, and they questioned why such intervention seemed absent in their present struggles. The events at Mount Sinai, where the laws had been given, also remained in the minds of thoughtful individuals. Voices arose from time to time, calling the people back to their earlier faith. These voices, often coming from members of the tribe of Levi, reminded the Israelites of their past and reproached them for their current practices. As custodians of the sacred covenant and servants at the sanctuary in Shiloh, the Levites took it upon themselves to speak out during times of difficulty. They described the former greatness of the people and the consequences of their present actions. At times, their words made an impression, stirring reflection and regret, yet these effects were usually temporary. The inclination to associate with neighboring peoples and adopt their ways remained strong. One problem led to another. The self-centered behavior of the tribe of Ephraim encouraged other tribes to focus only on their own survival. Opportunities to unite under a single leader were missed. As a result, the tribes became increasingly divided. This division led them to form alliances with surrounding nations, strengthening ties through both marriage and shared religious practices. Over time, these connections weakened their distinct identity, leading to internal conflict and a decline in their national strength. The original inhabitants of the land, observing these developments, recognized the influence they could exert over the Israelites. Seeing them no longer united, they began to treat them not as equals, but as intruders. Their attitude shifted toward domination, seeking to humble the Israelites and, if possible, to bring them under complete control. After the death of Joshua, a period of difficulty and instability came upon the people of Israel. The sense of direction that had existed under his leadership began to fade, and the unity that had once held the tribes together weakened. What followed were years marked by hardship and decline. One tribe after another fell into subjugation. This meant that instead of living freely in the land they had struggled to obtain, they became subject to the authority of surrounding peoples. These neighboring groups, who had not been fully driven out during the earlier conquests, regained strength and imposed their control. The Israelites, divided and lacking strong leadership, were unable to resist effectively. As time passed, the condition of the people worsened. Their sufferings increased to the point where they could no longer be endured without response. In these moments of crisis, individuals arose from among them, men driven by a sense of responsibility toward their people. These were not kings or rulers in a formal sense, but leaders who emerged in times of danger. They became known as judges, a term translated from the word shoftim, which in this context refers not only to those who decide disputes, but to those who act as deliverers or rescuers. Their role was practical and immediate. When a tribe, or sometimes several tribes, faced oppression, these men would gather fighters and lead them into battle against the oppressors. Their actions often brought relief. Through courage and determination, they achieved victories that freed their people, at least for a time, from the control of their enemies. These acts of leadership and bravery stood out in a period otherwise marked by weakness. However, their influence was limited. Each of these leaders operated within a specific region or among particular tribes. They did not possess the authority or the means to unite all the tribes of Israel into a single, coordinated body. Once the immediate danger had passed, their leadership did not extend into a lasting system of governance. Because of this, the underlying problems remained unresolved. The tribes continued to act independently, without a central authority to guide them. The condition of disorganization persisted, making it difficult to establish stability or long-term security. In addition to political and social challenges, there was also a decline in religious discipline. The practices that had been established earlier, particularly those connected with the teachings given at Mount Sinai, were not consistently followed. Idolatry, the worship of multiple gods or images, spread among the people. The judges themselves, though they acted as deliverers in times of crisis, were not entirely free from the influences of their surroundings. They shared many of the weaknesses common to their generation. Their understanding of the earlier teachings was incomplete, and they were not able to restore or enforce a strict adherence to those principles. As a result, while they could respond to immediate threats, they could not bring lasting order to the nation or fully guide it back to its original path.